Thank you very much, Hilary, for those kind words. In Australia, it is our custom to begin any public lecture by acknowledging the people on whose lands one is speaking. Thus, I would say that I wrote this talk on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and acknowledge their leaders past, present and emerging. I do not speak their language, but I acknowledge the vast body of music and oral tradition transmitted in the Australian continent over thousands of years. Here in London, it is more difficult to identify the particular British tribe who owned the land before the Saxons and the Normans, but here in St George's, we should remember its remarkable rector, William Stukeley, for first stirring interest in the builders of Stonehenge. We might smile at his suggestion that the builders inherited a Phoenician culture dating back to before Abraham. But I think Stukeley's recognition of the spiritual vitality of those early Britons deserves our respect. Artifacts like the Waterloo horned helmet and the Gundestrup cauldron, which you see here, of debated origins, provide a silent reminder of a pre-Roman culture whose oral traditions are largely lost to us. Nonetheless, even the horned helmet conveys affinity between a warrior and a horned animal. In the cauldron, as we see deer antlers evoking both prowess and wisdom in a mystical vision of harmony within creation, from the wild boar to the wise man holding a snake. My expertise is not in Indigenous or Celtic studies in themselves, but rather in medieval thought. In particular, I'm interested in how 12th century scholars in Europe encountered the Celtic past, just as 20th century anthropologists encountered the first peoples of Australia. So this evening, I wish to share thoughts inspired by encountering what are called songlines, which I define as orally transmitted stories about the journeys of spirit ancestors or guides across the land. I do so by attending to those from whom I have learned much and see how those voices might knit together. Artifacts from the past have often been generated by concern to preserve insights in serious danger of being lost unless recorded in a fresh and meaningful way. And this is the context, I think, of much of what we're going to talk about. Well, I'd like to begin, though, by acknowledging Kathleen Raine and her collaborators in founding the Temenos Academy, for providing an opportunity to reflect on the Temenos, a sacred place or grove marked off from public land, and defining a hieron, or something holy, something belonging to or dedicated to a god or a divinity. André Vaucher, great medievalist, puts it well in describing a sanctuary as created not just by a ritualizing process, but as, I quote, a space traversed by narrative, the collective memory of actors with particular aims. The Temenos was a place from which one could invoke sanctuary from worldly authority, an idea taken over by Christian churches in offering asylum. The word academy is another name for such a place of sacred encounter, in this case dedicated to Athena, goddess of wisdom. On the Areopagus at Athens, there was an altar to an unknown god that St. Paul argued was a divinity implicitly known to all people. In the 6th century, this passage from Acts inspired a figure known as Dionysius the Areopagite, was mentioned by Luke, to reflect on both knowing and not knowing as central to this journey of discovery. Names change over time. In the early medieval period, the monastery was considered the place of sacred encounter. By the 13th century, the universitas, or collectivity of masters and students, was taking over as a Temenos, a place to discuss every kind of learning, although with a lot more argument. There's always been a problem with arguing about the sacred, particularly when one doesn't actually participate in a spiritual journey itself. You're always talking about rather than being in. And this, I would argue, is where performing music, above all song, is central to glimpsing any Temenos or experiencing any Temenos or sacred place. Yet inevitably, we each have our favorite Temenos, where we feel comfortable, whether it is in the Scottish Highlands or the Australian outback. And our preferred guides, we may differ, whether we prefer Plato, the Buddha, Jesus, or the prophet. They all talk about the journey which each of us must undertake, often away from the crowd, though with a message for wider society. I'm also grateful to an Indigenous artist whom I discovered while writing this talk, Uncle Richard, Uncle Patrick Campbell, whose image that we see here, Miminyari, or he translates as my mother, which is actually reproduced tragically without often identifying the author, is used to publicize this talk. Now, he was born in 1958, and he is part of what we call the stolen generation. He was snatched from his parents by government policy and placed in a notorious boys' home, where he was subjected to appalling abuse, sexual and physical. In the process, he was robbed, like so many of his people, of the sacred stories that gave him identity. He told me how he endured a darkness of drink, drugs, and collapse. He also explained to me that this image, which he calls Mimi Nyari, my mother, speaks about his own story of finding a way back through retrieving symbols, in his case, from both Catholic culture and Indigenous tradition. As we can see, the rainbow serpent articulates the spirit of the land, waterholes as the sources of life, each connected by an artery or songline that gives life to the land. In traditional Indigenous communities, every group, every subgroup has its own songline, this orally transmitted epic song, sometimes very, very long, about the journey of a spirit guide, totem, or ancestor, whatever word we use. Singing the song regenerates that community through returning to its source of nourishment. The places where songlines and those different guardian spirits intersect becomes a spiritual place where traditional arguments have to be put aside. In his case, Uncle Richard is telling us about his own journey to reconnect to his mother, indeed our collective mother, understood as the land in its broadest sense. The rainbow serpent is here what Christian discourse calls the Holy Spirit, that which gives life to the land, the mother of Jesus. Indigenous thinking privileges speciality very differently from modern focus, which is very temporally driven. There's a really good theologian of Indigenous culture, Michael Bowden, and it's called Unbreakable Rock, which is his translation of the notion of, in Arente, which is the Central Australian area, the sacred, or which he likes to call unbreakable rock. And articulating, again, a similar theology, which is both Indigenous and Catholic in the broader sense. And in his glossary, Bowden explains that there's a word in Arente, Altwenga, also written as churunga, refers to something sacred, like a message stick, a concept to which I shall return, the churunga as a relic, a sacred relic. Well, some might find such juxtapositions awkward. They reflect the very dynamic character of an indigenous culture in its encounter with religious traditions. As Uncle Richard put it to me, his journey is the way of the cross. Well, archaeologists have established that human occupation of northern Australia goes back at least 60,000 years. This has generated enormous linguistic diversity. You can't read the signs, but you get a sense of the different language groups with different colors. And the oldest traces of human culture are identified by the use of ochre, as found, particularly in the Kakadu region up in the north. So this is thereby going to be referring to the Gulf of Carpentaria, which is that sort of square bight at the top of it. And it's in the north, you just see how many language groups, which is a sign of how old this settlement is, and then larger groups as you go forward down to the center. But the expansion of Anglophone culture is, of course, vast and horrific in its destruction of many of the older traditions. Now, for historical reasons, the region I'm going to be speaking about is particularly the Arrernte region, which is central Australia around Alice Springs, although I'm also going to be referring to my friend John Bradley, who writes about the north and the Carpentaria, the coastal area. This is a gallery, cave paintings, but what we have, this is in the Kakadu, a gathering of what are called locally mimi, which are defined in a local dictionary as, I quote, thin spirits who live in the stone country inside cracks in the rock or caves. They are often mischievous and not particularly friendly. They do not venture outside of the protection of their rock environment, as even a light wind can snap their fragile bones. Well, I think these images articulate the instability, the potential danger, and yet also the vitality of the natural world. Any community must learn where and how it can share water and other resources needed for its survival. This learning is done not just through images, but through songs, sacred songs, about the journeys painted about these spirit guides. When we look at images like those, even in the Gundestrup cauldron from Europe, or painted onto the caves of the outback, we can only imagine the songs about their journeys. Also central to oral tradition is what the Arrernte, which is in Central Australia, they call churunga, or a sacred object or a message stick that belongs to, is the property of the spirit to which it is dedicated. And a sacred text, whether the Torah or a book of the Gospels, is like a churunga. It belongs to a specific spirit guide, is divinely inspired. And a sacred text, whether the Torah or the Gospels, it can be seen as a kind of message stick. Even the relics of a Christian saint can be seen as a mediating spiritual power in the same way as an indigenous churunga. But to fully access their power and meaning, those oral traditions need to be sung and performed. Well, I'm now going to shift gear very radically to look at 12th century Europe. And very different from the sacred sites of Indigenous Australia are the much more crowded and hierarchically structured cathedral cities of 12th century Europe. The process of recording oral traditions in writing, described by Michael Clancy in From Memory to Written Record in relation to property documents, also applies to stories about origins, about ancestors and saints. They were transferred to writing in the 12th and 13th centuries. Gerald of Wales attests to the vitality of such oral traditions in his own native Wales, including that of singing, in parts, in fact, in his case. Perhaps less well known as a witness is a Flemish monk, Herman of Tournai, who is author of a book called On the Miracles of the Virgin of Long. And its first two books record the account of relics being taken around France and then southern Britain, and the miracles generated by these relics. In fact, people would drink water that had washed the relics. Now, we may smile at this sort of event. It was frankly a money-raising event. They wanted to raise money for their cathedral because the bishop had been murdered in a political crisis of the worst kind. And in fact, I don't know if you can see much of the little initial at the that we see here is, I'll just go to the next account. Well, I'll come to it. Let me just see. Oh, I think I've got to, yes. This is just a little bit of background about Herman. Don't read all the detail, but he's born in Flanders. People thought he became a monk as a child, but in fact he actually goes and studies in Long. And he's only 22 years old, and this is a discovery that I've made, that he actually goes on this travel with the relics. And so he describes a procession of relics around the Loire Valley and then across southern Britain, from Canterbury to Bodmin. And he actually sees and reports sites connected to Arthur that I will come back to. And this, if you like, he is a living record of some of these oral traditions. Now, this might seem strange, but there are places and people who may know. This is in Tournai itself. The practice of processing with relics still continues each year in that city on the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. And Herman tells us in that this procession started in 1092 because, in honor of the Virgin, because of healing from a ravage of ergotism, which is a kind of deadly fungus. And in a fractured urban community, divided between local Flemish and pro-French political interests, the honouring the Virgin provided a way of generating civic harmony. In fact, writing in the 1140s, Herman lamented that, even 50 years after starting it had now become unspiritual celebration. They were enjoying themselves rather than forgetting the true meaning to it. But it actually has been performed every year since the beginning of the 12th century. And the role of the Virgin is both to offer social healing, but also personal healing. Perhaps I could also suggest that rituals like the Stations of the Cross, even sayings of the Rosary, are like an internal procession, which have a more spiritual quality, perhaps, than these great public jamborees. But they all have their social function. Well, my interest is really in the process by which these oral stories and traditions are put down in writing. And I like to do so now by introducing two figures who are quite an interesting contrast. One is Ted Strehlow, or Strehlow in Deutsch, but he's called Strehlow, and he's his proper Theodore, but they call him Ted, so I'll refer to him as Ted. And Bruce Chapman, the Songlines. They're both lovers of the Australian. In fact, I think I've got an image of the two of them. They're both, handsome young men, both lovers of the Australian outback. But Strehlow was steeped in classics and medieval literature. He was born at Hermannsburg in Central Australia, and to missionary parents who were themselves quite remarkable, because his father had actually translated the New Testament into the local language of Arente. Well, Strehlow devotes himself to recording the oral traditions of Central Australia, particularly between the 30s and the 50s, mid-50s. But he never found the academic recognition he craved. So his book is massive, is 750 pages, and I will be speaking about what he has to say because it's really neglected. Chatwin, however, is the salesman. He visits Australia for a few weeks and writes a bestseller, which is called The Songlines, which will have an enormous influence, and unfortunately a negative influence in my view in doing it. But Strehlow is the figure that I find really interesting. Look, I've got some detail, but don't worry about, there's a little picture, there's probably the text there. He is born to this remarkable family, a huge German culture, and anthropologists do not read Latin or Greek, and they've never recognized that he was a medievalist as a classicist. But this was what I discovered. He was a remarkable figure who lives in the outback, and he knows some of the last speakers of the great oral traditions. And what is particularly important is that he was absolutely opposed to a very influential anthropologist called Spencer in Oxford, a trained biologist, who writes a book with Frank Gillen called The Native Tribes of Central Australia. And the problem was that they never understood that they had only a few words of Arente, had no idea of the literature. But it's going to be the Spencer and Gillen's book of 1899, which will really inform thinkers about the medieval, about the world. So this is, let me just, and the title is unfortunately simple, Songs of Central Australia. It's actually not an addition of texts. It's an attempt to identify the great, to situate the oral songs and epics within world literature. It's a vast work, perhaps too ambitious. Now, Strehlow did not himself use the word songlines, but is acutely aware that such songs describe what he calls a totemic landscape. Unfortunately, this book, huge book, got a dismissive reputation, the TLS. It was expensive, a limited print run, and then there was a controversy created by at his death, because he had collected a big collection of shurunga, sacred objects, and his wife was not liked by the local community, and it created a friction that still lingers, so much so that while in 2016 I was able to read the great book in my university library, last year I was told that I needed permission from the original speakers of the songs, which I could not get, because they lived between 1930 and 1950. In fact, I found a copy in another library where they let me read it. But that's just to tell you how politically sensitive these issues are. But something that's not realized is that he was actually very influenced by two medievalists, the Chadwicks, who were great authorities on world literature. And in fact, between 1932 and 40, this couple write 3 volumes about the oral literatures of the world, not just Europe, Russia and Asia, 1940, Africa, Borneo and Polynesia. And as soon as the first volume came out, Strehlow was using that work as a basis for understanding Australian epic. Now, the Chadwicks never spoke about Australian literature because nobody had given them any. But this was what he was doing. They were picking up, the Chadwicks were picking up on an awareness of ritual and the sacred. It's still, their great classic was called The Growth of Literature. And this actually shapes Strehlow's own understanding. And there's a book about, which I don't particularly care for, someone called Barry Hill, who describes Strehlow as he willed the Aranda literature into being in 2 simple ways. First of all, by deciding that it was taxonomically literature following the Cambridge Don, Hector Monroe Chadwick, and by, I quote, imperialistically applying his faith in Logos to the detriment of the lived true nature of the original. I don't care for that. Strehlow did follow, certainly, the Chadwicks in elevating the category of literature as a value in itself. But to speak of Strehlow imposing his faith in Logos is simply too crude a dismissal of his desire to assert the dignity of verse. And this is what Spencer and Gillen had no sense of, the oral storytelling tradition. Chadwicks use of the word totem deserves a comment. This is a term that comes from the Iroquois. It was picked up by Sir George Grey, who travels in North Australia in the 1840s, and then it becomes, through Fraser, it becomes standard to say that all of these primitive cultures believed totems, and in fact, most famously, Freud, Totem and Taboo. The subtitle, if you can read it, is Some Points of Agreement Between the Mental Lives of Savages and Neurotics. And it tells you how, and they were all drawing on Spencer and Gillen, as also was Durkheim, who studies his great theory of, is the great inventor of sociology of religion, that religion is a social device. He was drawing on totemism as explained to him by Spencer and Gillen. And it's the sacred without story, which is exactly the opposite of what Rocher was saying, a space traversed by a story. Well, Chatwin's perhaps most influential contribution was to publicize this word songline, which had been used by a previous anthropologist in 1978, Tonkinson. He said, they trace ancestral tracks and illustrate dreamtime happenings in abbreviated, rhythmic, and exciting fashion. Well, Strehlow was himself dismissive of Spencer and Gillen's notion of the dreamtime, which becomes hugely popular. And Chatwin idealized, and this was the problem with Chatwin idealizes songlines as a kind of a universal network of roads across Australia, completely without reference to their literary context. His understandings of Indigenous culture is, I'm afraid to say, not profound. And what he was doing was projecting his love of nomadism, which is, for a limited period having no fixed address. Wonderfully illustrated by Robin Davidson, writes a book called Tracks in 1980, which is how she crossed Australia on camels. But of course, that is not the Indigenous experience. It's much more local. So far from connecting Australia, it gives identity to a very local area, to each community. So it creates a fictitious idealism, and I'm afraid to say that even, Aboriginal museums are drawing on this image to publicize themselves, to make them look like an Australian national sacred culture. Well, Chatwin concludes with aphorisms about Cain and Abel. He uses Heidegger on the song still remains, which names the land over which it sings. So he's a travel writer who never stayed put and who never grasped that songlines are in fact intensely local, rooted in stories, for example, of the dugong or the honey ant. And these songs connect a particular community or subgroup to its sacred space or Temenos, its own local waterhole. It has been argued that Chatwin was imposing a Christian agenda onto Indigenous culture. I think his real problem was not about imposing a religion, but it was about generalization and failure to absorb any local linguistic tradition. Well, I would argue that Strehlow was much more sensitive than Chatwin, although he's much less known. One of his most moving passages in the songs is his experience of being allowed to participate in the sacred ritual of communicating sacred songs, addressed to what he called, following Fraser, totemic ancestors. So Strehlow describes how a small group of elders, each from a different clan group, came together, each with their own churunga of a particular spirit, meeting in deep silence, and instead of offering food, they each take turns to offer a song, each rubbing a churunga and calling its spirit by name. In the Gundestrup cauldron, each creature can be seen as the totemic ancestor of a particular group, presented here as in harmony. By comparison, the medieval Virgin presides over the angels and saints of heaven, but without any sense of animals in the wild. We see here a radical shift in the presentation of a Temenos, a sacred place. While many of us can no longer recall epic verse from memory, such stories about journeys to such a place still function as a form of cultural DNA, subconsciously shaping our identity. Medieval heraldry regularly links a community to animals in the natural world, like whales being embodied by a dragon. The royal standard of the United Kingdom provides its own emblem of authority, nominally recognizing its first people through having a Prince of Wales, the real Britain. This might seem radically different, but Deborah Bird Rose, a wonderful anthropologist, in 1992 writes, "Dingo makes us human," to explain that for those for whom the dingo is their guardian spirit, it is the dingo which makes them human, accessed by performing the songline of the dingo. Perhaps not unrelated to seeing creatures as messengers can be glimpsed in the images of the winged creatures in the Book of Kells, each symbolizing an evangelist and thus a particular angle on Jesus. Matthew is a teacher, Mark a wild lion or voice in the wilderness, Luke the gentle sacrificial calf, John the eagle. Like the images in the cauldron, they reflect 4 dimensions of the cosmos: the human, the domestic, the wild, and the celestial. The wings on each signify that they are like birds or messengers or angels communicating the Evangel, the gospel. In Christian iconography, the dove leads Noah back to dry land, as well as resting on Jesus to signify his being the anointed one, the Christos. In Fra Angelico's Annunciation, the angel Gabriel has the same face as the Virgin, as if the angel is her self-image. These winged images instruct us not to stay still, but to go on a journey for Christians that climaxes in the cross and beyond. Well, I must now acknowledge my particular debt to John Bradley, a colleague and friend, author of a wonderful book called Singing Saltwater Country, Journey to the Songlines of Carpentaria, 210, the ideas of which have already underpinned much of what I've had to say. His own expertise is in the oral traditions of the Yanyuwa people in the far north, in that Carpentaria area. While not Indigenous himself, he has lived in that region for 3 decades, earning the trust and friendship of the local population. He shares with Strehlow, he may not admit this, but he does, I think, a respect for language and literature without getting caught up in the heavy erudition that probably weighs down Strehlow's desire to insert the poetry into the canon of world literature. Bradley writes with the accessibility of Chatwin, but with a much greater awareness and sensitivity of the language over years, not a few weeks, of knowledge. Perhaps the best way of accessing his work is through his translation of part of a dingo kujika, which is his Yanyuwa word for a songline, which is published as an appendix to the book, and allow me to read it. Song of our ceremony, we have carried you and now bring you back, driving you back a long way down into the country. We make you rest. At Majikala, the dingo stirs from sleep. At Majikala, the dingo stirs. He gives thought to the journey. Spoonbill, with flattened beak, stirs the mud in Mujikala lagoon. Water lilies float on the waters of Majikala. The dingo sings the songs of the Wulubawa ceremony. The Mambalaya whirlwind rainbow serpent spins dust high into the air. There is no time here to present a full reading of, this is just a very short excerpt of what is a magnificent oral literature that evokes the coming to life of the dingo, the spoonbill, the water lilies, and the rainbow serpent. A detail that reminds us of the serpent in Uncle Richard's image giving life to his mother. As in the image of the evangelists, different creatures are linked to different elements. whereas Strehlow frames Indigenous oral literature within a taxonomy from the 30s of Chadwick's. Bradley simply shares what he has learned from his Indigenous friends, unconcerned by any other literary tradition. He faces the same problem as Strehlow faced in the 30s, and he has told me this, that the younger generation are no longer knowing those great epics. And in fact, this has driven Bradley, John, to create digital animated versions of these kujika, sung by the surviving speakers of the language, subtitled in English. So very moving. That's really what excited me, and I got him to teach the first class always in world religions as a way of introducing other sacred texts, which are always oral. The song tells the journey of a particular spirit becoming itself. The song is itself the guide, an orally transmitted logos, as it were, in which reanimates the land and communicates truths of an unwritten law. These kujika employ rhythm and regularity central to poetry, music, and dance to convey the law, L-A-W, of the land. And this is the notion that even Strehlow doesn't quite get to, but John is central, and I'm indebted to this sense of the law as the unwritten teaching, which is there, which is known and mediated by these great epics. Singing is a much older cultural practice than telling stories. It imitates the birds and the way they celebrate life. Bradley opens his book with a sentence that he had heard used by a Yanyuwa woman, Eileen McDinney. Everything got a song, no matter how little, plant, bird, animal, country, people, everything. As with Uncle Richard, Eileen's very Irish name speaks to a cultural fusion that has taken place as rootless Irish migrants took Indigenous wives or women, generating offspring who would then be stolen from their mothers. So McDinney is saying that there is a song in everything that exists. And I think she's formulating an image, an insight that Boethius formulated in more abstract Platonic terms in the De Musica, in which musica is the underlying harmony underpinning the cosmos, body and soul, in humans as well as in physical instruments. This brings us back now to songlines in Europe. There are still many stories about how animals and the Aberdeen bestiary, each of those creatures tells a moral lesson. You could say Animal Farm is the ultimate in that sort of process. But we have a tradition, and it goes back to Gregory the Great and beyond, of the Holy Spirit as the dove, speaking, and of course here it is being written down. So this is the medieval transformation of those traditions. The creature, the dove, is becoming subservient to the authority of the written word. But this is something which happened and happens, I think, with all religious traditions, where a spirit is preserved by being recorded, and then, of course, it becomes about the preservation of the text and its meaning, and generating much debate. Even perhaps the creed is like a hymn. It's a story of redemption, which is recited, and that's the form that gives identity to a Christian community that calls itself Catholic or Orthodox. But I think thinking about songlines as orally transmitted sacred texts can help us reevaluate, I think, all sacred narratives. Within the British Isles, Ireland has left a particularly rich deposit of saints' lives, and I think that these very much, I've written about this, that the stories of the saints wandering around Ireland, like Carthage, like St. Patrick, or my own parish is dedicated to St. Carthage, and there's a story about how he collected lepers and took them from Rahan, the centre, down to Lismore, like a kind of a Moses. So that was his version of the journey, if you like, the journey of Abraham and Moses and of Jesus being retold. Well, in 12th century Europe, we have changes, profound changes are taking place. Herman of Tournai is a sort of an exemplification of this process. So this, what I've just got up here, that all of these religious traditions have an oral foundation, but they are known by being preserved. There was this is what we see in Tournai, when we have being carried round the city. So in a sense, giving life to that people. There's a little story that I just want to quickly tell. I won't read the whole thing. This is a story that Herman tells. People were getting healed by these miracles because they believe. And, psychosomatic medicine tells us that at least 30% of healing is because we believe that they will have faith. Well, there was a case that they met somebody who was a Cornishman who believed that Arthur was still alive, and the French canons didn't like this, and they thought, no, Mary has real power to heal, and it was proven by the fact that the Cornishman didn't get healed. The Virgin didn't like it. And in fact, I'd say that that's like two rival competing songlines, which are at odds with each other. It's a kind of, one is about Arthur as somebody who would come to heal. And in Cornwall, they saw the English as the invader and the Normans. And Arthur was a symbol of someone, a redeemer figure. We have these oral traditions who would return. But of course, from the Christian missionaries Arthur was Christian, but we have a story presented here about the Virgin as having a larger authority. And of course, whereas early Middle Ages, the focus was on saints, individual saints, the Virgin has no body. The relics are her shirt, something that touched her body that they owned at the cathedral. And the Virgin becomes a figure of a larger collective community. So carrying around these relics, which are like carrying around the churunga, the sacred object, is not just about marking out her territory, it's about giving an identity and allowing people to share in a collective journey, which is in fact the journey of the cross, as experienced by the Virgin, her joy, her sorrow, her suffering and transformation and ultimate redemption. So let me conclude. A little bit. Medieval Christian songlines about the journeys of saints have clearly evolved far beyond those of the first peoples of Australia. The theme of a journey would be transformed further by imagining journeys into the underworld. There's an Irish story about Nugdale who goes down to the Patrick's Purgatory. In the 14th century, Dante would continue this tradition through this Divine Comedy about a journey that begins with Virgil taking him down to hell, then journeying through purgatory, led by Beatrice to paradise and contemplation of the Virgin. In 20th century Australia, the story of the stolen generation is that of another descent into the underworld, very real, presenting a way of the cross that in his own way is what Uncle Richard was telling us about in that image. And he has done a whole series of Passations of the Cross, which are quite extraordinary. I've seen them, but he told me that nobody's written about his work, and so it's one of my I would like to do is to make his work better known. But if I can summarize now with a few dot points, some of the key messages of what I want to say about both Indigenous songlines and medieval Christian stories of spirit ancestors, I might put them thus. First, I think summaries of traditional religions have often focused too much on beliefs as false rather than true, and not enough on the stories that they tell. And Durkheim epitomizes this, it's all about totemism, and religion shapes the community. It's a political tool which is useful, but it's not part of one's intellectual identity. Of course, Durkheim was relying on this sort of exploitation narrative, by Baldwin and Spencer, which gained weight and traction and has shaped contemporary attitudes to religion, but it has nothing to do with what we call now lived religion, which is a different concept, which does weigh on story. Focusing on beliefs as either true or false leads to dismissing others as other communities as primitive, as somehow backward. Religious literacy, which is the cause for which I fight, involves respecting other languages. Strelhow's Songs of Central Australia, with all its academic limitations, deserves respect, as does the concept of songlines, against the oversimplifications of Bruce Chapman. Each society develops stories and songs, formulating assumptions relevant to that community and offering a guide to a journey. Such songs are themselves the spiritual guides. And I think each of us needs a conceptual structure to identify from where we come, who we are, and where we're going. But our stories must be sung and performed to become real. We have to make sense of our own personal journey by sharing that with others. For that, I thank you.